Hello everybody, my name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, robot, and loin streamer, and today we have a lot of things that I want to cover. I had even more things, and they just kept piling up over this last week. So we're going to get to a handful of them and see how long this video goes for. But a couple of things before we get started. Number one, if you enjoy what I do on this channel, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on this channel, check out the links down in the description below. I have two ways to feature people on this channel. Number one is with Lamoy. It is the monthly writing prompt contest here, and I give out a prompt. You guys answer it, and then in the first Monday, I'm going to say first Monday video of the month, I read what you guys have written, and we bask in your glory. The second thing is, or the second way, is the Fresh Meat feature, which if you are an indie author and you've got your story out there, or it's getting out there, it's on its way out there, submit your first chapter and cover down at the link below for the Fresh Meat feature, and I will read that on the channel. Those are picked at random every week, and maybe you'll find more readers. So there's that. Number three, if you would like to check out any of my books, they are at all of your favorite bookstores. I have a new one that is coming out in October called Plead More, Body More, the second book in the Body More trilogy. And if you haven't checked it out yet, check out my Majima music video. I worked decently hard on that. I spent like more time than I should have preparing that video. Oh my gosh. And for what benefit? For what benefit? It's With that said, let's jump into the stories and discussions and whatnot. The first one is a little tiny Twitter thread that I would like to keep very, very brief, because it is a bad take, but it's also, I don't think it's a serious take, but it's a bad take, which Philip Pullman decided to bear arms to this last week and said, I don't care how many people enjoy it. Fiction in the present tense is an abdication of narrative responsibility. I resent having to recalibrate my entire attitude to time whenever I open a novel in the present tense. Away with them. Well, sir, well, I love present tense. I also specifically love present tense first person. 3 out of my current 4 books are in present tense first person, and also my favorite author writes in that, which is Bret Easton Ellis, or my favorite fiction author. Favorite nonfiction is Brian Masters, but I digress. I love first person, and I love present tense. It's a little weirder if it's like third person present tense, but I'll still get into it, because at the end of the day, and I said I'm going to keep this short, so at the end of the day, everything that is related to writing, whether it's first or second or third person or present or past tense or any of the tropes or whatever, they're all just tools for an author to use to best tell the story that they have to tell, and everybody is free to like what they like, dislike what they don't like, but that's kind of where it ends for me. Is like not telling people what to do or how to use the tools, or insulting people for the tools that they use. I'm not into that. So agree to disagree. Philly P. Yeah, that's all I got. The other thing that I saw this last week came from Writer Beware. So I thought this was pretty important to talk about, because there's a new scam apparently going around where somebody was going, it looks like somebody was going around claiming to be Jenny Bent from the Bent Agency via email. And though the links go to the real Bent Agency website and the city address is correct, it's a scam. Real reputable literary agents very rarely reach out to writers they don't already represent, and if they do, it's a personal approach, not a form letter that doesn't mention the writer's name or the title of their book. Other indications include ungrammatical text, apart from the last paragraph, which has been copied from the Bent's Agency's Who We Are page, not something that you'd expect from a reputable agent, and an email address that doesn't match the agency's web domain. Impersonating reputable agents, editors, and publishing people is a very common tactic for fake literary agent scams that are so common these days. So just be wary if you get something from somebody, not just the Jenny Bent, but if you get something from somebody claiming to be an agent or a publisher and they reach out to you unprompted in any way, double check this stuff, because they very commonly will prey on you and your hopes and dreams. That's how they make stuff happen, is they see that you are a hopeful individual and they go for the throat. So I will link this in the description below if you want to take a closer look at the emails specifically. But I remember the last time I went to FWA conference in 2019, and there was even a panel on fake and scam alerts going around then, and the many people that fall for them. And yeah, just be careful out there with being prompted by people. So the next thing I want to talk about has been going around on Twitter about Barnes & Noble, because they have apparently started announcing a change that they are making on the national chain. And if you've been seeing the chatter on Twitter about Barnes & Noble not stocking debut hardcovers, you're not alone. Writers recently sounded the alarm after hearing from various sources that the chain's stores would only be stocking hardcovers that had proven sales records. When I saw this conversation take off, it pinged the former bookseller part of my brain that had been tracking brick and mortar stores or news, because B&N had made quite a few changes to their stores in the past 2 years that are worth looking at. So let's talk about the news. While much of this is anecdotal, it's not like it's not likely that Barnes & Noble would go on the record about this kind of policy, and are enough supporting and there are enough supporting responses on a tweet from the 17th to make it clear that many authors with hardcover releases, particularly in kids and middle grade, are not being stocked even in their local Barnes & Nobles. This isn't limited to debut authors either. Kelly Yang, the award-winning author of the Front Desk series, posted a video in which she announced that she had been specifically told that Barnes & Noble would not be stocking her newest book in her series. Scroll through the responses to Baptista's tweet, and you'll see many other authors with the same stories. Independent publisher distribution books weighed in to note that this holds true for their own experiences as well. Barnes & Noble is a key piece to the in-person book-selling world. Despite Amazon controlling the lion's share of the book sales in the US, everyone in publishing seems united in agreeing that without Barnes & Noble as even a small counterweight to the e-commerce behemoth, book-selling as we know it would be doomed. As Ellen Alder, publisher of New Press, told the New York Times, it's funny how the industry has evolved so that they are now the good guy. I would say their rehabilitation has been total. And while highly selective buying practices are par the course, it's impossible for any store to carry every book published, and any store has the ability and any store has to be able to select for what they believe they can sell. With stores across the country, Barnes & Noble fills an important role in the ability of readers to discover new authors. This, above all things, is the one reason that buyers bringing in fewer hardcovers is such a scary thought for so many authors. We'll get into discovery and the potential impact on this later, but first, let's talk about some pieces of what's actually happening and why now. There are a few factors to consider here, starting with Barnes & Noble's recent sales and leadership revamp. In 2018, the board fired its chief executive. A summer later, hedge funder Elliott's Advisors purchased the chain and put James Daunt in charge. Daunt was responsible for taking the UK chain Waterstone from bankruptcy to profitability, and he has gained some ground from Barnes & Noble since 2019. Despite the pandemic's decimating foot traffic to any branches, sales were up 3% in 2021 over pre-pandemic numbers in 2019. Daunt's strategy includes downsizing the central office formerly responsible for ordering for all of the stores, limiting them to minimal orders, and allowing store managers greater discretion in what to bring in their local sales, and eliminating the co-op displays or pay to display to put in more practical language in which publishers could purchase premium placement for specific titles. Other priorities include further narrowing the mix of books, education games, puzzles, and workbooks, store refurbishments to include an emphasis on smaller tables and wider aisles, expanding online, and reducing out of stocks. Smaller tables, that means less room for those stacks of new hardcovers. Stores also have more discretion over what they promote, and if you don't already know that the retailers are dedicating those spaces to sell titles that are, say, hot on TikTok, you do now. It's a smart business move, there's no doubt. Customers, especially teenagers whose dollars retailers are hungry to acquire, are now just as likely, if not more, to come looking for a book they saw blowing up on social media as an older customer might come looking for a book they saw in the New York Times or heard about on NPR. And those books are and those books that are blowing up on TikTok, not necessarily debuts or hardcovers for that matter. Many of those books have been out for years that new authors are only now just discovering thanks to the magic of algorithms. Again, not a bad thing for books in general or authors lucky enough to get the book talk bump, but let's add another piece to the puzzle. While the pandemic has been overall good for reading, with specific types of books getting huge sales, it hasn't necessarily been great for debuts or for hardcovers. Book sales are currently down across formats in quarter one of 2022 versus quarter one of 2021, and while many expected it, a 12.4% drop in hardcover sales is not something that bookstores, publishers, or others are going to feel blasé about. It's also not likely to get any better considering that the US is staring down the barrel of a recession and continuing to deal with rising prices. So let's add that together for B&N. Central ordering has been downsized, publishers can no longer pay for placement, stores have less display room, and hardcover sales are down. Add that to the anecdata about Barnes & Noble buyers being even warier of bringing in new authors, and you've got a recipe for panic. Which brings us to impact. Discovery is the perennial, there we go, holy grail of publishing. How do you get someone to see or hear about your new book? There's no one right answer, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something, but physical discovery, i.e. walking into a store and seeing that book on the display table, has long been one of those key elements, which is why publishers have historically been, it's what everyone who loves to go to the bookstore loves about being in a brick and mortar store. You can pick up a book, read a page or two, look at the synopsis, maybe see a shelf talker by a staff member, take it home, despite never having heard of it before. Online retailers have been trying to duplicate this experience with varying success for decades. So currently the only place to get that experience is physical bookstores. There are no good answers here, and it's true that none of it is necessarily new. It's the next step in the continuing reduction of literal shelf space. The more people buy online, the harder it is for brick and mortar stores to stay afloat. The fewer hardcovers people buy, the fewer hardcovers those stores will order. I have sympathy for buyers who, in efforts to keep their stores profitable, have to make hard choices about what they can successfully stock. But I have just as much sympathy for authors who see yet another door closed for them and who are told by fans or friends that their books aren't in stock at Barnes & Noble around the corner, who just want a reader to be able to find their books. I mean, I get it, because I'm also struggling, to have people notice my books. My books are over here just going, hey, notice me. I got a cool little raven on the cover. Check me out, You'll find you at local books, library, whatever. But I get the hustle, and I get that it's hard. It's the thing that pretty much all of us struggle with. And if we could capture it in a bottle, like that thing specifically that makes a book super easy to discover or like thrust in front of people, that's how we would populate everything. What I would be super interested in, so I have a couple of other thoughts on this specifically. It's a business decision, yeah, and it's going to hurt authors. So one of the other things with this is, what is one of the bigger reasons that people are like, go and be traditionally published? And so as a debuting author, you can get your book in the bookstore, in the brick and mortar bookstores, like to show off to people for that discoverability, because that is life-changing for a book, or it can be life-changing for a book if people take notice to it and your publisher invests in getting that book in front of people. But if they're not going to do that anymore, then you've just lost yet another benefit. And this kind of goes in line with the Penguin Random House merger as well, because they're saying, well, we're not going to be hurting the authors anymore. There's still going to be as much competition, but Penguin Random House isn't going to be bidding against itself to represent the author or to publish the author. So then we have yet another thing that is going to compound on top of authors and the deals that the publishers are making with the authors. And it seems more and more like Trad is having some issues that are making it look more and more like it's coming with more and more cons. One of the things that would be really cool, it says less shelf space in general, but one of the things that I think would be really cool is if there was some way for places like Barnes & Noble to open up a query place for indie books to be submitted to possibly be carried on the shelves. And it could be just very similar to how libraries queue stuff, where you can have a formal review on the book, like with Book Life or with Publishers Weekly or with Kirkus, with like any of that, have a certain number of reviews on the page, and that would help to sort of weed through some books. Like, you don't have to have 1,000, but just enough to show that there is some interest going into the book, because it is a business decision. And like, do a test run. Reading over this, it does suck. But it also just seems like a business, and they're trying to save what is a business that is possibly drowning. And if this guy saved a different business that was drowning, he's doing what he needs to try to, or what he thinks he needs to try to save the business. And what can you do? Stuff sucks. Choices hurt you when somebody's trying to make themselves. And what are you gonna do? Like, you can complain about not being able to get your book in hardcover, which I don't know how many people purchase hardcover first. I like paperback more, to be honest with you. Yep. But just imagine they kept going the way that they were going until they were broke, bankrupt, and they had to shut everything, and then nobody got the shelves. So who knows how long this is going to go for, if they're going to revamp a way to have more debut authors and to have more hardback books. I would love to know what your guys' interest is in hardbacks. Do you prefer paperback or hardback or ebook? Let me know in the comments down below, because I would be interested in seeing what the split is on that. The next story that I wanted to talk about is a brief one from LitHub, talking about the PR trial, or the Penguin Random House trial has revealed a barely hidden scorn for independent publishers, which we all knew was there. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I'm going to give you a general idea of what is being talked about in here, and if you want to check it out, the link will be down in the description below. But over the past 2 weeks, writers and publishing professionals have been riveted by the coverage of the trial in which the U.S. Department of Justice is attempting to block the Penguin Random House purchase of Big Five rival Simon & Schuster. As a member of the independent book publishing community, I've been by turns frustrated and astounded by much of what the Big Five CEOs and other witnesses have said on the stand, which has been diligently relayed via live tweets by publishing journalists John Meyer and Bethany Patrick. Throughout the trial, witnesses from the publishing industry have referred to independent presses as farm teams, a metaphor which apparently originated in a 2019 memo written by late Carolyn Ridey, who was the president and CEO of Simon & Schuster until 2020, according to John Meyer of Publishers Weekly. This phrase, which resurfaced several times, deeply ranked me and others in the independent publishing community. Farm teams, also known as feeder teams or minor leagues, were invented around 100 years ago to develop inexperienced baseball players to a higher skill, with the goal of creating more dominant Major League Baseball teams. Though I haven't been able to get my hands on a copy of Reedy's memo, the implication of this reference demonstrates a patronizing view of independent presses, along with a real misunderstanding of independent publishers and the role that we play in the literary landscape. The author of this article says she does not view book publishing as a zero-sum competition game, but unlike the baseball system, independent presses are in competition with corporate conglomerate publishers for writers and employees, for readers' attentions, and for dollars. Minor league baseball teams compete against other minor leagues, but independent presses publishing books in the independent presses publish books in the same landscape as larger publishers, where Penguin, Random House, Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, and others already benefit from substantial economies of scale and bargaining power with printers, customers, and more, an advantage which this merger would increase further. Many of the baseball teams were, at various times, funded by their major league counterparts and have official affiliations that bring benefits to the minor league teams. In publishing, however, the only official affiliation between independent and the Penguin Random House Simon Schuster are via distribution deals with some independent presses, which are, by design, lucrative for the distributors. Referring to independent book publishers as farm teams implies that they are small-time, amateur, lower quality than the massive corporate publishers that dominate the publishing landscape. It also implies that indie presses exist solely to develop raw talent to the standards of Big Five or Big Four or Big Five for their benefit. The implication would cut a little less deeply if the corporate publishers didn't also act this way. An editor at the Independent Press told me a story of how during a signing in an indie press booth at a literary conference, they watched an editor from a prestigious Big Five imprint compliment and try to set up a meeting with the author, who was at the conference signing their books for a small press that had just published. And though this example is particularly flagrant, it's my impression that the corporate publishers often scout from indie press lists. Calling indie presses farm teams paints a picture of a world where bigger is always better. It equates money and scale with value, implying that earnings the most money and increasing scale are the ultimate aims of writing and publishing. This assumption, with a this assumption, which is common under extractive capitalism, isn't always accurate, and I believe it's extremely damaging to the literary landscape as a whole. Now, there is a dichotomy, not a dichotomy. There is a balance that you have to strike with publishing, which is a business, and writing, which is an art, but it's not always an art, depending on how you do. I'm not even going to get into that because I'm not going to word it right, and I'm going to just butcher the thought. But there is a business side to it. There are people that get into writing specifically just to make money, make passive money, sell into a market, and then just make all of the money in the market. You'll see them with the 20 to 50K people. Those people are going in to make the money and see it as a passive income once you get everything in there. And so there is a measuring or weighing the art versus weighing the money, and how do you fund the art projects with the projects that are the money-making projects. You see bigger artists do this all the time. But going into the subject of this specifically, this author is correct. Indie publishers and self-publishers are constantly and always publishing against or competing against the big five. Even though we don't have the same resources, we are vying in the same actual marketplace, and we're looking at the same customers, and we're trying to reach basically the same customers. And so it's not really fair to look up and down in that way. And I pretty much read, I think this about the same amount of indie versus not indie books. I don't even pay attention anymore to like who published. I don't think I ever actually paid attention to who published what. I just kind of see a book and I go, oh, that goes on the list. Oh, that goes on the list. And I'm meeting so many cool, different, and very different writer people, authors. Yeah, let's bring the language down to writer people. But I'm meeting so many interesting and different authors that do so many different things through having this channel or just looking at the art and writing community on different social media. And I'm adding books all the time that are just from so many different creative perspectives that I love it to just see all of this different stuff. And it doesn't even occur to me who is the publisher. It doesn't matter, really. If your book looks professional, it really doesn't matter. But of course, the big four or the big five are going to want to continually demean you as an indie in any sort of way so that you feel like you need them, so that you feel like your book will never be complete without whatever it is that they can do for you. And there's nothing specifically wrong with indie or trad. It just is depending on what you want, how much control you want, how much you're willing to put into that book, what you want on the other side of that book. And there's a leftover prestige that comes. I say leftover as if it doesn't mean something to have somebody else's approval on your book to the point that they invest a bunch of money into it and go. But even as an indie, think of it this way. If you had like a single person come to you and say, hey, I would like to invest $10,000 into the publication of your novel, you know, getting all of the professional work done, maybe $50,000, just so we can make sure everything is covered legitimately. Would that not be just as endearing, just as complimentary as a publisher coming and saying, we're going to take your book? But imagine that individual investor was like, you still get to have all of the control, you get to look for this stuff, but I'm investing in you, I'm giving you this money to invest in this and make it come back. Would you see that as having very much of a difference between trad and indie when it comes to the investment of the book? Because that's often sort of what trad does for you when you go trad. Anyway, that's what I think. Just some loose thoughts on this. I know that I'm kind of flip-flopping around. My mind has not been very focused this week. But so let me know what you think about this issue between trad publishers and indie publishers and the reputation with trad versus indie. And, you know, trad may be thinking that indie is this little bean whatever that they can just pluck up because everybody in indie wants to be trad, right? So then the trads can just come over and be like, we can take what we want because you're a loser waiting to be picked at the prom, ain't ya? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. The last thing that I wanted to talk about this week is an update to the discussion around Salman Rushdie's situation, where, in case you missed it, he is the author of the Satanic Verses, which was written in the 1980s. And over the last couple of weeks, he was doing a talk, a seminar in New York, where somebody ran at the stage, where a religious extremist ran at the stage and then stabbed him a couple of times, stabbed some of the staff that was around a couple of times, and I believe the last that I've heard is that Salman Rushdie is alive, but he is likely to lose his eye. This is recorded like a week before it's going to come out, so if there are any more updates, I'm sorry about that, but this is what I know at the moment. And then there have been discussions about free speech, specifically because well, for obvious reasons, he got stabbed for the choice of his subject matter. So I wanted to bring this up to you guys because we've been talking obviously a lot about like canceling and banned books and books in schools and libraries, but what does it ultimately mean when it comes to freedom of speech or the ability to talk or the ability to have ideas and talk about books, and where are the conversations being had and what are those conversations being had about? So I've got an article I've got an article from New York Times and I've got an article from The Guardian that I want to run by you guys and get your thoughts on the subject, so get ready for that. Jennifer Schuschler writes, 2 years ago, Salman Rushdie joined prominent cultural figures, signing an open letter decrying an increasingly intolerant climate and warning that the free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted. It was a declaration of principles Mr. Rushdie had embedded since the 1989 when a fatwa by Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, well, that just threw me so much. The supreme leader of Iran calling for his murder made him a reluctant symbol of free speech. The letter, published by Harper's Magazine in June 2020 after racial justice protests swept the United States, drew backlash, with some denouncing it as reactionary display of thin-skinned and privileged, signed, as one critic put it, by rich fools. The reaction dismayed Mr. Rushdie, but didn't surprise him. Put like this, the kinds of people who stood up for me in the bad years might not do so now, he told The Guardian in 2021. The idea that being offended is a valid critique has gained a lot of traction. Last Friday, after Mr. Rushdie was stabbed roughly 10 times on stage at a literary event in a western New York, many wondered if the fatwa handed down more than 3 decades ago in response to his novel The Satanic Verses had reached its gruesome, belated conclusion. Writers swiftly denounced the attack, as did the leader of Britain, France, and the United States, but almost as quickly the attack became the latest flashpoint in the roiling 21st century debate over free speech, liberal values, and cancel culture. Speaking on BBC Newsnight on Friday, the British columnist Kenan Malik suggested that whilst Rushdie's critics had lost the battle, they had won the war. The novel, The Satanic Verses, continued to be published, he said, but the argument at heart of their claim that it is wrong to give offense to certain people, certain groups, certain religions, and so on has become much more mainstream. To a degree, he said, you should say that many societies have internalized the fatwa and introduced a form of self-censorship in a way that we talk about each other. The American writer David Reef suggested that on Twitter that The Satanic Verses would run afoul of sensitivity readers if it were submitted to publishers today. The author would be told that words are violence, just as the fatwa said. Then, when The Satanic Verses was published in 1988, the lines over free speech were not as neat as some may remember. The novel, which fictionalized elements of the life of Prophet Muhammad with depictions that offended many Muslims, were labeled blasphemous by some, inspired sometimes violent protests around the world, including in India, where at least a dozen people were killed in 1989 after the police fired at Muslim demonstrators in Mumbai, where Mr. Rushdie had been born into a prosperous liberal Muslim family in 1947. In the West, the defense of Mr. Rushdie was hardly universally robust. Former President Jimmy Carter, writing in the New York Times in 1989, denounced the fatwa but charged Rushdie with vilifying the Prophet Muhammad and defaming the Quran. While Rushdie's First Amendment freedoms are important, he wrote, we have tended to promote him and his book with little acknowledgement that it is a direct insult to those millions of Muslims whose sacred beliefs have been violated and are suffering in restrained silence. The added embarrassment to the Ayatollah's responsibility. The British writer Roald Dahl called Mr. Rushdie a dangerous opportunist. The British novelist John Berger suggested Mr. Rushdie withdraw the novel lest he unleash a unique 20th century holy war that would endanger bystanders who are innocent of either writing or reading the book. At the same time, there were some defenses from the Muslim world. The Egyptian novelist Naguib Mahfouz found the book insulting, but signed a letter defending Mr. Rushdie's right to publish. And in a 1991 article, the Syrian intellect Sadiq Jalal al-Azam accused Western liberals of having a patronizing view of Muslims. Perhaps the deep-seated and silent assumption in the West remains that Muslims are simply not worthy of serious dissidents, do not deserve them, and ultimately are incapable of producing them. In 1990, Rushdie made a carefully worded statement of apology in a futile attempt to have the fatwa lifted. In later years after the fatwa, Rushdie lived under tight security in London as several of his translators and publishers were attacked, some fatally. In 1998, after the Iranian government stated it no longer backed the fatwa, he moved to New York City, where he became a fixture in literary and social circles, popping up at parties, events, in the media. But as the fatwa seemed to fade in significance, the conversation over free speech shifted, particularly in the United States. The notion that offensive speech is violence gained ground as younger progressives increasingly critiqued the principles of free speech as too often providing cover for hate speech. Free speech became a rallying cry for conservatives who used it as a weapon against liberals they accused of wanting to censor opposing views. Tension over free speech were thrown into high relief in 2015 when the writers group PEN America decided to present an award for courage to the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, which had continued publishing after French Muslim terrorists ordered 12 staff members in an attack on its offices. 6 writers withdrew as hosts of PEN's annual gala over concerns about the award on the grounds that the magazine had trafficked in racism and in Islamophobia. More than 140 prominent writers subsequently signed a letter protesting the honors. Mr. Rushdie's reaction to the protest was blunt. "I hope nobody ever comes after them," he told the New York Times. On Twitter, he called the 6 writers who withdrew, some of them were good friends, an obscene name, and labeled them 6 authors in search of a bit of character. After last week's attack, many writers and world leaders rushed to express solidarity with Mr. Rushdie. President Emmanuel Macron of France hailed him as the embodiment of freedom and the fight against obscurantism, against the forces of hatred and barbarianism. Hadi Matar, a 24-year-old New Jersey man, was arrested at the scene and charged with second-degree attempted murder and assault with a weapon. Law enforcement and officials have not publicly stated what the motive of attack was, which Mr. Rushdie's family said had left him with life-changing injuries. But in literary circles, some observers saw a reticence in some quarters to name the specific force that had long targeted Mr. Rushdie. In an email, the writer Thomas Chatterton Williams, one of the organizers of Harper's letter, said that he had been impressed by the response from many writers. Struck by the comparatively mute response from many of the voices who have dominated conversations around justice and oppression since the summer of 2020. He wrote on Twitter after the attack on Friday, "Words are not violence. Violence is violence. That distinction must never be downplayed or forgotten, even on behalf of a group we deem oppressed." But some come close to Mr. Rushdie's expressed reluctance to immediately use the attack as fodder for highly politicized polemics on free speech. In an interview, Hari Kunzru, a British-born novelist who said that he had faced 4 separate court cases in India stemming from his participation in a public reading of the Satanic Verses in 2013, declined to comment on Mr. Rushdie's role in shifting the free speech debates. He cited both the rawness of his emotions and the way that free speech has been weaponized by people who don't actually have a genuine commitment to it. Mr. Rushdie, for all of his full-throatedness, never wanted to be a symbol. The horrible irony of this inventive, playful writer being defined by many of this dreadful, somber threat. In an interview on Sunday, Ms. Hakian, who came to the United States as a refugee in 1984, said that at the heart of the Rushdie case is being able to say that we, as writers, as novelists, as thinkers, can absolutely take on any issue we want in our works, and that includes Islam. But nobody is saying that, she insisted. Instead, people are paying lip service to free speech. In his recent autobiographical novel, Homeland Elegies, the American writer Ayad Akhtar reflects on the complex meaning of the Satanic Verses controversy for Muslim readers and writers, including himself. In an email on Sunday, Mr. Akhtar, who is PEN America's current president, said that the attack on Mr. Rushdie is a reminder that harm of speech and the freedom of speech cannot hold equal claims on us. While we may rightly acknowledge that speech can harm, it's in the terrible culmination of Salman's dilemma that we see the paramount value, the absolute centrality of freedom of thought and the freedom to express that thought. For many, defending Mr. Rushdie and the Satanic Verses against this would-be assassin may be easy, Mr. Akhtar said, but the defense also has to apply where we have less unanimity, where we are more implicated. That That's what it means for it to be a principle. And I agree with this totally, which is often why pretty much I'm always like, write whatever you want. Have the freedom to express the things wherever you want. And it's often, I feel like when you say you can write whatever you want and try out your own things, there's this implication that you can't, that you're trying to say that people can't be critical back to it. But there's a difference between being critical back to something in, your objective way, in your subjective way, and like, stabbing somebody 10 times because they wrote something, or trying to destroy somebody's life because they wrote something, or thinking somebody never deserves to work again because they wrote something, or this new stupid trend that I really hate where people's literary or entertainment preferences are moral, and if yours they consider immoral, then you deserve to have your life ruined because for some reason we can't like or write or experience different things. But I've talked about this a lot, so I don't know how much I want to harp on it, because I also want to invite anybody in the comments to express what they think, whether they agree or disagree, or where they fall on the line of this, because this is a contentious issue. So, I'm not, I want to invite the conversation, specifically. Now, in comparison to this one, where it's saying we must have free speech and ideas and things thrive, even if we don't like them, that is what it is to be principled, I wanted to contrast that last article from New York Times with this one from The Guardian. That is by Simon Jenkins, that says, "Do you want free speech? Then it has to be regulated now more than ever." Responses to the assault on Salman Rushdie have combined personal sympathy with the general defense of free speech. Sympathy should come first. The second remains controversial. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but what of words can never hurt you? Witness the Iranian government blaming of Rushdie himself and his supporters. If he, not Iran, that lies hurt. It is he, not Iran, that lies hurt. Freedom of speech is one of the most slippery concepts in political philosophy. John Stuart Mill pronounced it absolute, but qualified it, as he did all liberties, where it causes harm to others. On that tenuous footing has grown the edifice of laws on slander, libel, incitement, and more recently the causing of offense. The grim reality is that too many appear to support the fatwa on Rushdie, whether out of personal affront to his writings or out of loyalty to their religion and its leaders. 24 countries banned Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses. Collective anger at the probably unread novel was then elevated into extreme violence, a situation not dissimilar to that of 2015 Paris killings associated with the Charlie Hebdo cartoon. When the violence passes beyond its individual victim to their identity group, it moves from the realm of personal grievance to that of collective revenge. Under the Blair and Cameron governments, ideas of offense, bullying, hatred were elevated to the status of crimes. Now, any chance remark by an offender might be broadcast to the world, often generating a synthetic response of group affront and possible litigation, if not direct action. Its ultimate absurdity was the inaccurate warning on the Merseyside police advertisement that being offensive is an offense. The latest venture by the state into the morose of the Johnson government's online safety bill with the bizarre concept of legal but harmful. However well-intentioned, it seeks to monitor an astonishing range of evil and indisciplines, from online stalking to incitement of riot, from phony medicines to fake Russian news. How it will work has yet to be stated. It is a censor's chart or nightmare. Regulating the internet has become a major political challenge. Europe faced similar crises in the advent of printing and evolved to licensing and copyright laws to handle it. The key then lay in identifying the author and the publisher. There had to be some accountability for the words. In contrast, the internet has led to an anarchy of dissemination. While Rushdie has authored a book and is accountable for it, many of his critics are part of a familiar social media future, an anonymous mob howling after the victim across the ether. Those worried by the lack of online accountability are convinced the only solution lies somehow ending anonymity in their domain. Some claim anonymity helps whistleblowers and others, but such benefits are massively outweighed by the harm done by the unruly and unkempt mob. The very fact that social media companies enjoy a global accessibility should impose an added obligation on corporations to accept that publishers are not platforms. Great as the technical problem may be, they must be held to account for the harm that they can cause to others. This is the debate now thundering into view. The correct response to the Rushdie outrage is not to plead for freedom of speech, but to ask, what it really means and how it is to be sustained and regulated, not to be done. That is not done through silence. So it is a very different take on this guy's side to be asking for regulation of speech to stop things and saying people should be held accountable if it makes a bunch of people angry. And this feels very much, in a way, similar to the morality clauses that people are putting, that publishers are putting into contracts that, oh, if somebody doesn't like you and it could look bad on the publisher, then they can cancel your deal for any reason, or for that reason, I guess. And just end your relationship with them. But I have to ask, if it is, so you said this thing and somebody else took offense to it and then they got violent, and so it needs to be regulated so that some other person doesn't become violent. How is that any different than saying you wore that skirt, so that guy jumped you, and so we need to regulate what you're allowed to wear so that you don't incite lust in men? Like, I'm not saying it's victim blaming in both of these cases. You're saying somebody else responded poorly to your thing, so we have to regulate what you can say so you don't piss off somebody else so they take action. I'm going to leave the question of the morality and the comparison of these two articles specifically on more speech and holding up against things that you may not agree with, but separating action and words. Or are you on the side of this where you need to prevent speech from being said that could cause violence in the future? And we're not talking about like incitement of violence. We're talking about stuff like Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. Did he deserve to be stabbed because he wrote that book? Should the publishers of that book, the people that chose that book, vetted that book, put that book in front of the bookstores, should they be held accountable for pushing that book through when it offends so many? Where is that line? Because I'm sure that we could all find so many things that we all find offensive. But I don't know about you, most of the time, I'm just like, I don't really care. The thing that I find the most offensive that I've read ever is stuff like Jack of Hearts, because it's pornography being put in the hands of children, targeting children. But that's all that I'm going to say on that stuff, so I don't roll into a tangent. I've talked about it enough. So with all of those articles in mind, I would love to hear, or discussions in mind, I would love to hear your thoughts on any and all of them. They will be, the links will all be linked. The links will all be in the description down below if you would like to check the articles out yourself and get another look. Yeah, with all that said, thank you so much for watching. Have a great weekend, and don't die.
Was that Wayland Cross in the trunk? Do you know, or is that something that's still being figured out?
The person in the trunk was not Wayland Cross.
Is he in trouble?
We don't know who did it, but as the owner of the car, the longer he's missing, the worse it looks for him.
Cross isn't a killer. For the last couple of years, the average number of murders in Baltimore has been over 300, and it's been going up. Mind you, that's only whatever the badges count as official murder, and believe me, there are people that don't count when they die. Wayland? If you're down here, tell me. I'm not talking to the badges, I've been looking for you. They found a body in your trunk. Why? Did you do that? To the left, plain black letters read along the wall. You walked in the corridor. Once that ends, you chose the dark is on the right. My vision goes blurry, flickers black and black and black for longer intervals until I can't see anything at all. I'm not screaming anymore, but my voice echoes back to me. Where the hell am I? You're dead, Josephine. Even smart people do stupid shit sometimes, right?